To this point in the course, we've seen that the New Testament Gospels, as valuable as they may be as religious documents of faith, are problematic as historical sources for the life of Jesus. Their authors were not eyewitnesses to the events they narrate, and were writing 35 to 65 years later. They did not live in Jesus' country and did not speak Jesus' language. Moreover, they inherited their stories from the oral tradition, and there's evidence that the stories had been changed in the process of their transmission. At a later stage in the course, we'll discuss how sources such as these can be used to reconstruct the life of the historical Jesus. But at this point, we might do well to move beyond the New Testament Gospels to consider whether there are any other sources that might help us in our quest to discover what Jesus actually said and did. As I've already mentioned, there are a couple of dozen other Gospels not found in the New Testament, books written by Christians about the life and teachings of Jesus. In this lecture, and the one that follows, we'll consider several of these other Gospels. In fact, we'll look at the earliest surviving ones among them. There are several important things to say about these non-canonical Gospels as a group. As a rule, the non-canonical Gospels are much later than the four found within the New Testament. Most of these non-canonical texts date from the 2nd to the 8th centuries. Scholars have debated for a long time whether any of them might possibly be as early as or even earlier than the Gospels of the New Testament. We'll see in the next lecture that there is a claim that can be made for the Gospel of Thomas along these lines, a Gospel that contains 114 sayings of Jesus, some of which not found in the Gospels of the New Testament. A number of scholars think that this Gospel was contemporary, at least, with the four of the New Testament, although I should say that this is probably not the majority opinion among scholars, but a good case at least can be made. The consensus among scholars, though, that this is the only instance in which we have a gospel that might be as old as our others. In fact, the other couple of dozen gospels appear to be much later. Most of them are well after the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Moreover, we can say that unlike the anonymous gospels of the New Testament, many, perhaps even most, of these non-canonical Gospels are actually pseudonymous. The reason I say they possibly are pseudonymous is because a number of these texts don't come down to us as full documents. In many instances, what we have are fragments of Gospels, so that we don't know the entire literary character of them. But the ones we have, many of them are pseudonymous. The term pseudonym means simply a false name. There are two different kinds of pseudonymous writings in existence, not just Gospels, but in general. In other words, the term pseudonym can apply to one of two cases. One is where an author takes a pen name. For example, when Samuel Clemens wrote as Mark Twain, it was just a pen name that he had. Or I mentioned in an earlier lecture that the translator of David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus was George Eliot, also known as Mary Ann Evans. Well, she adopted the name George Eliot for her novels. It was simply a pen name. That's one kind of pseudonymous authorship. A second kind of pseudonymous authorship is where an author claims to be somebody that he or she is not. By which I mean the author claims to be a famous person, knowing full well that they're not that famous person. That's the kind of situation we have with most of these non-canonical Gospels. These books actually claim to be written by Jesus' apostles. In these lectures, we'll consider Gospels that were allegedly written by Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. I'll talk about that Gospel at the end of this particular lecture. And another Gospel that allegedly was written by his own brother, Judas Thomas. Other Gospels claim to be written by such people as Jesus' disciple, Bartholomew, his brother James, his female companion, Mary Magdalene. All of these books appear to be forged. In other words, the authors wrote in somebody else's name with the clear intention of deceit. Most of these non-canonical texts appear to have used the canonical Gospels as well as oral traditions about Jesus, oral traditions that the authors themselves had heard. The earliest of these Gospels, though, may not have used Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The vast majority of them obviously did use Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we'll see in one instance in this lecture. But the earliest ones possibly did not know about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because these books may not have been widely in circulation at the time. We need to remember that in the ancient world, books were not mass-produced the way they are today, so that today when an author publishes a book, within the week, they'll have hundreds of copies found throughout the country and even overseas. In the ancient world, the only way a book could be produced and reproduced was by hand, which is a very slow process. And so by and large, books were not massively distributed as they are today, so that there'd be nothing unusual in seeing a second century author having no access to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the earliest Gospels appear not to have, but the later Gospels appear to have used these four canonical books. As we'll see, since Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not available evidently to the author of the Gospel of Thomas, that's what makes his own account particularly useful for us in reconstructing Jesus' actual teachings. Most of the other accounts outside of the New Testament, though, are highly legendary in character, as we'll see by looking at several of them. It's possible to categorize the non-canonical Gospels into three groups: infancy Gospels, narrative Gospels, and sayings Gospels. Infancy Gospels provide stories about Jesus' birth and childhood. Many of them draw on the stories of Matthew and Luke for their accounts. By and large, Matthew and Luke don't tell us many stories about Jesus from the time of his birth up to his baptism. In fact, there's only one story about Jesus as a youth in these Gospels. That's in Luke chapter 2, where Jesus is a 12-year-old, a story about him being in the temple talking to the teachers of the Jewish leaders. Matthew doesn't tell any stories after the narrative of Jesus' birth, and Mark and John also have no stories of Jesus' young life. These infancy Gospels, though, do have stories of that sort. Narrative Gospels are like the Gospels of the New Testament in that they contain accounts of the life and sometimes the death of Jesus told in narrative form. And third, sayings Gospels principally contain collections of Jesus' teachings, often without any narrative context at all. We'll consider an example of each of these kinds of Gospels over the course of the next two lectures. I'm going to begin with an example of an infancy Gospel and focus my attention on the so-called infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the earliest non-canonical Gospels and almost certainly the earliest of the infancy Gospels. Scholars debate when the infancy Gospel of Thomas was actually written. There are very few internal clues that can help us date the book, but some scholars think that it was produced as early as the first half of the 2nd century. In other words, possibly 30, 40, 50 years after the Gospel of John. The book is attributed to a person who is named Thomas, a word which means twin. In some parts of early Christianity, it was believed that Jesus had a twin brother named Judas Thomas. Now, when I teach these other Gospels, my students, my undergraduate students, frequently are puzzled by this claim that's found in some Syrian Christian traditions that Jesus had a twin brother named Thomas. It's quite clear in the New Testament itself that Jesus is alleged to have had brothers and sisters, as we'll see later in this course. Mark chapter 6, John chapter 7, several other sources mention Jesus' brothers. One of these brothers is called Judas, or Jude. This is the person who allegedly wrote one of the books of the New Testament, the book of Jude. But how is it that he would be a twin brother of Jesus? Well, in fact, in traditions in Syria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was believed that this person was Jesus' twin brother. But how could Jesus have a twin brother if, in fact, his mother, when he was born, was a virgin? Well, it's difficult to know what these Syrian Christians were thinking about when they maintained that Jesus had a twin brother, because they never tell us in any of these traditions. My own hunch is that they are relating to Jesus an ancient Greek tradition of people who were born as twins, in which one person would be born the son of a mortal and the other would be born the son of a god. Probably the most famous instance of this ancient Greek myth occurs in a play by the Roman playwright named Plautus. The play is called The Amphitryon. It's a very humorous, interesting play about a Greek general named Amphitryon, who is married to a beautiful woman called Alcmena. In fact, Alcmena has been made pregnant by Amphitryon before he goes off to war. While he's off at war, the god Zeus, looking down from his heavenly perch, sees Alcmena and realizes that she is gorgeous beyond belief, and decides that he too wants to sleep with her. And so he comes down in the guise of Amphitryon. In other words, he makes himself appear like Amphitryon and comes to Alcmena, who thinks now that her husband has come back from war, and welcomes him with open arms. And Zeus then goes to bed with Alcmena, and according to Plautus, Zeus enjoys the evening festivities to such a degree that he commands that the constellations stop their movement so that the night will prolong itself many times over. And finally, when even the god Zeus has had enough of their frolicking, he orders that the constellations once again begin their procession. And then when the morning comes, he up and leaves. Unfortunately, the next morning is when the real Amphitryon does show up from war and comes home to greet his wife, who treats him rather casually, not understanding that, in fact, he has not spent the night in her arms. He doesn't understand this, but she herself then becomes confused until the whole thing unravels and becomes clear what happened. Well, what happens in the end is that, in fact, she gets pregnant by both. She was previously pregnant by Amphitryon, and she bears to him the mortal Iphicles, but she's also been made pregnant by Zeus. And she bears to him the demigod Heracles, so that Heracles, the demigod, has a half-brother, Iphicles, who's mortal. Were the Syrian Christians thinking of something like that about Jesus, that he had a twin brother? Possibly. We simply don't know because they haven't told us. In any event, it was believed that Jesus had a twin brother. This gospel, this infancy gospel of Thomas, apparently claims to have been written by Jesus' twin brother, who describes the activities of Jesus while he was a young boy. Who better to know what Jesus was like than his own sibling? The motivating question behind this account of Jesus' young life has continued to intrigue readers of the New Testament ever since. If Jesus was a miracle-working Son of God as an adult, what was he like as a kid? Well, it turns out that the boy was a bit mischievous. The account, which we have preserved for us in ancient texts that have been translated into English for us, I'm quoting the text that actually it's a collection of texts that I've got in a reader called the New Testament and Other Early Christian Writings. The account begins with Jesus as a 5-year-old. When this child Jesus was 5 years old, we're told, he was playing at the ford of a stream. He made the pools of rushing water and made them immediately pure, ordering this by his word alone. So he clears up the muddy water just by commanding it to be pure. He then made soft clay and modeled 12 sparrows from it. It was the Sabbath, though, when he did this. There were many other children playing with him. A certain Jew saw what Jesus did while playing on the Sabbath. He immediately went and announced to his father Joseph, "See, your child's at the stream and has taken clay and modeled 12 birds. He has profaned the Sabbath." Joseph came to the place, and seeing what Jesus did, he cried out, Why do you do on the Sabbath what's not lawful to do? You see, Jesus has worked on the Sabbath by making these clay pigeons, and people are upset. And so Jesus responds by clapping his hands and crying to the sparrows, "Be gone!" And the sparrows flew off chirping. The Jews saw this and were amazed. So this is a terrific incident in which Jesus is accused of violating the Sabbath. He makes these birds to come to life, and he then, in effect, asks, what birds did I make on the Sabbath? He, in fact, has destroyed all evidence of malfeasance. Jesus is portrayed in his early years in this account as a bit temperamental. In the next story, we read that a playmate of his takes a willow branch and muddies up the water that Jesus had purified. Jesus is angry and tells the child, "You unrighteous, impious ignoramus, what did the pools and the water do to harm you? Behold, you shall also wither as a tree, and you shall bear no leaves, nor roots, nor fruit." And immediately we're told that child was all withered. The parents come and bear this withered one away, bemoaning his lost youth, and they reproach Joseph, "What kind of child do you have who does such things?" Later on, Jesus is walking through the village, and another kid comes up and bumps into him, runs into him, and this irritates Jesus, and Jesus turns to him, curses him, and withers him on the spot. Much to the dismay of the parents in town, Jesus appears to be an unsafe child to have in the village. Jesus' wrath, though, is not reserved just for other children. We read of a story later where Joseph intends to have Jesus learn how to read and write. Decides he needs to learn his letters. So he takes Jesus to a teacher. The teacher says, "I will first teach him Greek, and then I'll teach him Hebrew." And so then he starts teaching him the alphabet, and he tries to get Jesus to repeat the letters. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Jesus, repeat after me. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Jesus refuses to repeat, and the teacher gets upset with him. "Please, repeat after me." No, Jesus refuses. Finally, out of exasperation, the teacher smacks the boy upside the head, which turns out to be the single greatest mistake he made in an illustrious teaching career. Jesus turns on him, curses him, and he falls down dead. Well, as time goes on, Jesus begins to learn how to use his powers for the good. There's an episode in which Jesus is playing on the rooftop. They have these flat roofs. Jesus is playing on the roof, and as it turns out, one of the other children that he's playing with falls off the roof and falls down and breaks his neck and dies. Well, the child come to see their child named Xenon lying in the ground. They look up. All the other children have fled, but there's Jesus standing over the roof looking down, and there's their child dead. They assume that Jesus has been up to his tricks again. They begin to reproach him. Jesus, though, leaps off the roof, jumps down, lands beside the child, and yells out, "Xenon, did I throw you down?" And Xenon immediately rises from the dead and says, "No, Lord, you did not cast me down. You have raised me." From then on, Jesus begins using his power for good, saving his friend from deadly snake bites, healing the sick, raising those whom he had previously killed, and proving to be remarkably handy to have around the house. When Joseph, the carpenter, has miscut a board for the bed of a wealthy patron, Jesus tells him not to worry. "Here, Dad, you stand at one end, I'll stand at the other." Joseph grabs the board, and Jesus then pulls it out to be the right length, so saving his father from incurring some financial loss. The account finally concludes with Jesus as a 12-year-old in the temple, surrounded by scribes and Pharisees who hear him teach and who bless Mary for her wonderful child that she's brought into the world. This is a story that the author has taken from Luke chapter 2. Clearly, this infancy gospel of Thomas is based on legend and on pious, or not so pious, Christian imagination. This book may have been written simply for entertainment. We ourselves, when we read it, find it rather entertaining. somewhat hard to take very seriously as a serious doctrine. But it may be that people in the ancient world, ancient Christians, looked upon this, in fact, as a pious account. It's very hard to say. What is clear is that if we want to know about the historical Jesus, this book is not going to be of much use to us. This book appears to contain late legends rather than historically accurate information. So too with with all of the other infancy Gospels and most of the other non-canonical Gospels. We find a much more serious account of Jesus in the second Gospel I want to look at in this lecture, a Gospel that's called the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is a fragmentary account of Jesus' trial, death, and resurrection. That was allegedly written by his disciple Simon Peter. It's one of the earliest examples we have of a non-canonical narrative gospel. The text of the Gospel of Peter was discovered in 1886 in the tomb of a Christian monk in Egypt. Archaeologists dug up this tomb, and they found buried with this monk this fragmentary text of the Gospel of Peter. The existence of the book had been known prior to its discovery from the writings of the church father Eusebius, who was a 4th century author who is now known broadly as the father of church history, whose 10-volume book, Ecclesiastical History, provides us with a good deal of our information about Christianity in the first 3 centuries. According to this author, Eusebius, the Gospel of Peter was read by one of the churches that was ruled over by the 2nd century bishop of Antioch, Serapion. Serapion was a bishop of Antioch, but he had a number of villages that were under his ecclesiastical jurisdiction. He allowed the reading of this Gospel of this Gospel of Peter in some of his churches until he received a tip from someone else that the book actually presented a heretical view of Christ. He then read it for himself and he forbade its use. We have to assume that what we now have in hand is this long-lost gospel mentioned by Eusebius with respect to Serapion. Unfortunately, though, it's impossible to tell if what we have is the book Eusebius was talking about. Eusebius mentions the fact that Serapion wrote a letter that detailed portions of the text of the Gospel of Peter that he found to be potentially heretical. Unfortunately, Eusebius does not quote these disputed passages for us that correspond with the passages of the book that we have. So we don't know if the book we have is the same book Eusebius was talking about, but it seems to be a likely assumption. Moreover, what was discovered in 1886, as I've indicated, was only a fragment of the original Gospel of Peter. This fragment that we have, we know it's a fragment because it begins in the middle of a sentence and it ends in the middle of a sentence. And so this is just a fragmentary portion of it. Let me read for you how this Gospel of Peter begins. None of the Jews washed his hands, neither did Herod nor any of his judges. As they did not wish to wash, Pilate got up. Evidently what's happened immediately before this is that Pilate has washed his hands during Jesus' trial. We're then told that Herod the king ordered the Lord to be taken away. He said, "What I order you to do with him, do it." So we're at the very end of the trial of Jesus, in which Pilate has apparently just washed his hands and nobody else wants to. The washing of the hands, by the way, in the New Testament is found only in the Gospel of Matthew, and we're not told there that no one else washed their hands. This is an emphasis found only in Peter. Just to show you the fragmentary nature of this text, let me go to the very end, where after the resurrection of Jesus, we're told that the author starts talking in the first person about himself and the other disciples. We, the 12 disciples of the Lord, wept and were grief-stricken. Each, grieving at what had happened, returned to his own house. But I, Simon Peter, and Andrew my brother, took our nets and went to the sea. And with us was Levi, the son of Alphaeus, whom the Lord... That's where it ends. This then is a fragmentary account that goes from the end of Jesus' trial up through his crucifixion and then his resurrection. The part of this gospel that survives is in many ways like the passion accounts of the New Testament. Jesus is put on trial before Pilate. He's condemned to death. There's an account of the crucifixion. 3 days later, he's raised from the dead. What's even more striking, though, than the similarities to the New Testament accounts are the differences. In the Gospel of Peter, the Jews are held to be even more liable for Jesus' death than they are in the New Testament Gospels. As you've just seen from the verse I read, it's the Jewish king Herod, rather than Pilate, who orders Jesus' death. The author emphasizes none of the Jews washed their hands, showing that, in fact, they were willing to take the guilt upon themselves. And the Jewish instigators of the plot against Jesus in this text know full well that they've sinned against God in condemning Jesus, as the text itself indicates. What's more, they not only urge that Jesus be killed, as they do in the New Testament Gospels, in this book they actually do the dirty work themselves, and then regret it, fearing that God will now destroy them and their city. Interestingly, in this account, Jesus does not appear to suffer. We're told that when he's hanging on the cross, he was silent as if he felt no pain. Verse 10. He was silent as if he felt no pain. This may have been what led Serapion to condemn the book. He may have thought that this promoted the ancient heresy of Docetism that I mentioned before, which stated that Jesus didn't have a real body, but only seemed to have a real body. He was silent as if he felt no pain. Moreover, perhaps the most striking difference between this account and the New Testament Gospels is that in this account we have an actual description of Jesus' resurrection. In the New Testament, there's no narrative of Jesus emerging from the tomb. He's buried, and then they find the tomb empty. In this account, though, there is a narrative of Jesus' resurrection, and it's very interesting. We're told that 2 angels descend from heaven. The stone in front of the tomb rolls away by itself in front of a large crowd that's watching. These angels then go into the tomb and they come forth with a third person between them that they're supporting. The 2 angels' heads reach up to the heavens. The person they're supporting, his head goes up above the heavens. Obviously, this is Jesus coming out of the tomb between the 2 angels. What's even more striking is that as they walk out, behind them emerges the cross. And a voice comes from heaven asking, has the gospel been taken to those who are asleep, in other words, dead? And the cross replies, yes. A striking account of Jesus' actual resurrection found only in this non-canonical text. Each of the distinctive features that I've mentioned about the Gospel of Peter with respect to the New Testament Gospels seems to indicate that it was written in the 2nd century. During the 2nd century, Christians had begun to hold the view that Jews were completely accountable for Jesus' death. Moreover, by this time there were docetic Christians who maintained that since Jesus was fully divine, he could not really have suffered. And the legendary details surrounding the resurrection appear to be later additions to the stories about Jesus. Whether this account had full access to the earlier Gospels of the New Testament and used their accounts to construct its own remains an open question that's answered differently by different scholars. There are a number of similarities to the New Testament Gospels, especially the Gospel of Matthew with things like the washing of the hands and a guard posted at the tomb. But on the other hand, there aren't any real verbal similarities, word-for-word agreements between Peter and the other accounts, so that it's hard to know whether it used the accounts as a source. In either event, it's clear that this was a relatively early account, written perhaps in the early 2nd century. In conclusion, there were numerous other gospel accounts of Jesus' life and death from the early Christian church. We've looked at one example of an infancy gospel and one example of a narrative gospel. Despite their early dates, these accounts appear to be highly legendary and of little use for us if we want to know what Jesus himself actually said and did. The matter is somewhat different with the third gospel that we'll consider, the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, which has no relationship to the infancy gospel of Thomas. I'll devote the next lecture to a full discussion of this intriguing text.